Hello, my name is the Reverend Dr. Chris Rogers, and I want to present to you today just an overview of my doctorate research. I've been exploring a topic that I think is really important for us in the church, and this is really around working class people playing their part in the church. To see churches on estates revitalized. So this will take maybe about 40, 45 minutes. And I'd like to take the time really to just explore some of the things that I've been looking at, my research and my findings. Some areas of this will be slightly more academic, but hopefully the findings will be interesting for you as we look at this topic. So the doctorate itself, the title is Jesus Called Working Class. Jesus Called the Working Class, Training Working Class Church Leadership. So that's the title. And the purpose of this research was this. The purpose of the research was to identify best practices for training of working class priests who will lead new worshipping communities in the Church of England. Um, there is a general problem within the Church of England, and it is this. The Church of England is very middle to upper class, and it does not matter how you cut the data, we will always find out that the Church of England predominantly reaches middle and upper class people. And that's not the same across all denominations. There are many denominations that seem to just be better at reaching more working class people. So the Church of England has a problem, and the data 62% of the Church of England seems to be middle or upper class. That comes from a YouGov survey from 2015, whereas only 38% would say that they are working class. And research that's been conducted by the Barna Group recently in Talking Jesus found that 81% of practicing Christians in the UK claim to have some form of university degree or equal qualification, which is a much higher percentage than the national average. So the findings of the 2017 Social Mobility Commission study found that nearly half of the UK consider themselves as working class and only 38%, 36% think of themselves as middle class, 1% as upper class. But yet we have a far higher percentage attending church that would class themselves as middle and upper class, which, in other words, friends, the church is far more middle and upper class than the national average. I think that's really important for us to recognize. And that is a problem. If we were to look at those that are getting ordained in the Church of England, friends, only 14% of the candidates that went forward in the 2018 2019 went through to advisory panel, only 14% said that they came from some form of social housing. Now, be careful, social housing does not necessarily mean working class, and there are certainly more working class people than there are in social housing. But there's a link there, really, between social housing and class, and recognizing that the Church of England is not reaching working class or those from social housing into leadership in the Church of England. There's a gap between those on the estates and those leading the church. And we need to bridge that gap. Why? Well, I would say it's quite important because there are 950 estates in the UK with no Christian presence on them at all. So if we want to put a Christian presence on those estates, the way we are going to do that is by developing working class church leaders. Now, most of my study really is focusing on how do we do that with ordained workers, but actually it's not just ordained workers, it's lay leadership as well, planting churches, planting missional activity onto these estates, using lay or ordained leadership. The study will predominantly focus on ordination and priestly ministry, but actually that's just a delimitation of my research. We need to be looking at growing lay leaders as well. So my research had four questions. One was around the distinctive challenges that the working class experience around the Church of England. The other is the obstacles that those working class people have in terms of training in the Church of England. So the distinctive challenges for them, but also the obstacles in terms of training. We then looked at the obstacles to theological training, looking at that from the educator's point of view. What are the challenges for working class people from those who are in the education business? What do they think about the problems? And then my fourth question was around what are the alternative methods? What are the methods that are out there that we can learn from that will help us maybe train people better? Now, as I say, this is particularly bent towards ordained ministry, but I want to underline the learning that I have here is also applicable to lay training. And I think that really needs to be heard by the church. We need to be investing into lay training, not just ordained training. So, as part of my paper, there are a number of sections. The key kind of thinking section is called a literary review. And there's 5 sections in there: the biblical, the theological, the historical, sociological, and the church planting. I'm not going to talk much about the historical, but in the historical, what I do is I look at how the church has grown lay and ordained leaders in the past. Spend a lot of time looking at John Wesley and the Methodist movement and looking at how John Wesley and the Methodist movement made lay leaders using classes and bands. These were essentially discipleship groups that helped people grow. I also look at movements like the Southwark Diocese, who trained what were called worker priests. And what these were men that worked on building sites during the day, but were ordained and served as priests in the local parish church. So men who were working on building sites were also ordained. And I just think it's an incredible model. People in the workplace also having a priestly ministry. And there are some stories about how these priests were breaking bread on building sites as well. So it wasn't just that they worked on the building site, break bread in the church. It's also that the building site became the place of worship for some of them as well. So I explored some of those models that we've seen in the past. When it comes to church planting, we looked at or I looked at models of church planting that work on inner city estates. Not all church planting models are automatically going to work on an estate. This idea of plant big, putting 50 people into a church on an estate to have a big launch is not going to work on an inner city estate. There's certain things ingrained into working class people on estates that will not react well to that model of church planting. So what we looked at was different models at work, and generally across the board, the rules were things like it had to be small and it had to be incarnational. It had to really engage with the locality, so not be a network church, but really plugged into the local community church, so that it had a real sense of locality to it. And I think some of the models of slow burn, slow growth, growing something from bottom up, not with a big planting team, but a small team to start. They're the kind of things that we looked at, we thought would work. That will be another video, another time where we can look at that. But what I want to look at is some of the biblical, theological, and the sociological things that are helpful and interesting for us as we think about the training of working class leadership. So one of the anchor verses for me was this from from Acts 4:13. And it just simply says this: when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. So St. Peter becomes, for me, quite a biblical anchor in terms of someone who was a working class or peasant class individual, owned his own boats. So he essentially had a small business, probably employed other fishermen as a part of that business, and he ran this small fishing company as a working class man. And then he gets called by Jesus. His name is changed from Simon to Peter. You now are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And from the rock that Jesus builds him church, Peter becomes the new, the bishop of the first church. So you can see a narrative there between somebody of peasant class journeying with Jesus, growing in leadership, and ultimately becoming the leader of the church. And we was describing him as the first bishop. So we have a narrative there of a working class man growing in leadership, having Jesus investing in him to the ultimate point where he is not just a leader, but he's a leader of leaders. Let me just read this to you. I thought this book was enthralling. T.W. Manson in a book called The Teaching of Jesus. And he says this: discipleship as Jesus conceived it was not a theoretical discipline of this sort, but a practical task to which men were called to give themselves and all their energies. Their work was not study, but practice. Get this, the work was not study, but practice. Fishermen were to become fishermen of men, peasants were to become laborers in God's vineyard or God's harvest field. And Jesus was the master, not so much as a teacher of right doctrine, but rather as a master craftsman whom they were to follow and imitate. Jesus was not educated in a rabbinical, discipleship was not education in a rabbinical college, but apprenticeship to the work of the kingdom. And I think this is really substantial. Discipleship to Rabbi Jesus was not about learning correct theology, but was about becoming apprentices to the work of the kingdom of God. Jesus apprenticed men and women in the work of the kingdom. And it was not done in the classroom, it was done in the mission field. And that is a substantial thing for us. It was not taught in the synagogue, but it was taught on the road. Yes, Jesus reads the Gospel of Luke. We see that is reading in the synagogue, but the predominant teaching of Jesus was done on the hillside, as many rabbis did at the time, because the weather permitted it. But really, there's something here about discipleship for Jesus being an apprenticeship model that was about apprenticing men and women in the way of the kingdom of God. And I just love those lines there around fishermen becoming fishermen of men, peasants becoming laborers in God's vineyard. Let's pause here for a moment. So Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic. Old Testament written in Hebrew with some Aramaic, New Testament predominantly written in Greek. The Greek word for disciple is the word mathetes, and always gets translated as disciple. The alternatives that it has is student or learner or apprentice, but actually it's translated as disciple. And we see that word a lot within Jewish writings, and it is a more academic word in the sense that a mathetes was somebody who was training under a rabbi to become a religious lawyer. So rabbis, yes, they taught the law of God, but also they became the lawyers within Jewish thinking. So there's a real academia, an academic study that's attached to the word mathetes. The Hebrew is the word talmudim with an M at the end. We don't find that in the Old Testament. That we find discipleship alluded to in the Old Testament, but it's not talked about in the New Testament. It's only talked about in the New Testament, not the Old. Now, let's talk about the Aramaic for a moment. So we have the Gospels in our English translations that come from the Greek manuscripts. But there are Aramaic manuscripts as well, but we don't have as many of them. Copies of text a little bit like the Pentateuch. And there's a debate over how old some of those manuscripts are. And are they transcriptions or translations from the Greek New Testament? So basically, is the Aramaic a copy of the Greek, or does the Greek come from the Aramaic? That's an interesting debate. But what is very interesting is no matter where you fall on that debate, is that the word that always is used in relationship to Jesus in the Aramaic New Testament is the word talmudin, which is the same as the Hebrew, but with an N at the end. And this word talmudin, 100% of the time gets translated not as disciple, but as apprentice. And there are many, many examples here where the word talmudin is used in other writings outside of the New Testament. So examples like this Mishnah Kaddish, craftsmen are not to accept apprentices unless they have been seen their craftsmanship. So what we find here is the word talmudin is always used in relationship to apprenticeship and craftsmanship. It's not linked to in the other writings around rabbinical law. So other examples, an apprentice of a weaver, an apprentice of a tailor, or a medical apprentice. So the word talmudin is used to talk about apprenticeship and the training of a master and an apprentice, which then I think has some effect on how we can end up reading the Aramaic New Testament. There's a phrase that I came across, which is wonderful, from Masters and Disciples, a spiritual power of craft in Judaism. And there was this phrase that was around at the time, Talmid Oman, which translates as apprentices of a craft. So there was this connection between apprenticeship and craftsmanship. I think that the New Testament, read in the Aramaic, has a slightly different slant on it. It's much more working class slant on it. And I would say that uh, texts like the Gospel of Mark is a much more working class gospel compared to the others. And if you were to approach it from a working class perspective, you see things that kind of, they have this apprenticeship, craftsmanship feel to them. So here's an example, Mark 8:34. It says in the English, when the crowd, so Jesus called the crowd to him along with the disciples, and he said, whoever wants to be my disciple, Talmidah, in the Aramaic, must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. That line particularly is reminiscent of a master and an apprentice, in that a master would turn to an apprentice saying, if you want to be my plumber, my apprentice plumber, pick up your plumbing tools and come and follow me. Go where I'm going. If you want to be a carpenter, pick up your tools and follow me. So if anybody wants to be an apprentice, it's like Jesus said, if you want to be an apprentice, they must pick up the tools of the kingdom and follow me. And what is the tool of the kingdom? It's the cross. So there's something about the writing, particularly the Gospel of Mark in the Aramaic, just has this working class flavor to it, that we see Jesus's language as a much more working class language. I want to just pivot from some of those biblical principles of Peter and discipleship and apprenticeship to what I'm describing as urban theology. And if we are going to look at the training of working class people, we have to understand their context, and that writing, particularly from the 60s and 70s and 80s, has been called what we would describe as urban theology. And much of this practical urban theology that came out of the 60s, 70s, 80s is predominantly negative. And the language that you see in urban theology tends to be that the working class are cursed people, they're victims of oppression. There's language around ideological enslavement. They're enslaved to an ideology that traps them in their estate. And that the urban environment really is a place of deprivation. And the words of deprived and cursed and victims all comes out of the urban theology. And then what ends up happening is, in that theology, the church comes as savior, comes to bring into the cursed place salvation. So urban theology tends to be very negative theology. And there's a big debate on that. And there are those that will disagree with me on that because they saw urban theology as championing something positive. But I just don't think that line of thinking has aged well at all. John 1:46, Nazareth, what good can come from Nazareth? And Nathanael asked, come and see, said Philip. And I think there's something I would like to say to you today. Like, come and see. There is a positive urban theology that I want us to explore. You might say, what good could come of the estate? What good could come of that cursed people? And I want to say, hang on, I don't think they're cursed at all. I think there's much more going on here that is positive urban theology. Let's talk about John Vincent for a moment. He wrote a lot in the 70s towards an urban theology. And one of the things that he championed in his thinking was that urban theology really stems from a place of where we start to ask three things. Who are we talking about? Like, where are they in terms of society and history? And what are they to be in God's action? So often that way of thinking, who are they, where are they, and what, often ended up turning for some people into, well, who are they? Well, these are people who are cursed because they have to strive and work. The work that they do comes out of the cursed, in the sense that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden and were told that, Adam, you're going to have to strive to work. You're going to have to work hard, and work will now be a curse for you. So this idea that working hard is a curse. So what we end up saying is, if you're able to get a good job and you can get better hours, then you're working your way out of that curse. So often the working class, the who is that they are cursed people, and the where are they in society in time? Well, where they are, their locality is a place of deprivation. Therefore, they're cursed. That their locality is deprived. And therefore, what are they in terms of God's action? Well, they're people that need to be saved. So the working class are often seen as deprived and cursed, and their location as disadvantaged. And a lot that came out of this writing of the 60s and 70s. I want to shift us. I would say this: we must shift to seeing the working class positively, valuing their resources and skills as rich and as intelligent, while also seeing the estate as fertile ground. I want to shift us to a positive urban theology, one that values the place of the estate and says, actually, the estate and those on the estate, there's rich resource here. The estate has got everything that is needed on it for those on the estate to thrive and succeed. The problem is what is there is often seen as deprived or not good enough, and therefore something has to come in to change it. And I want to argue, actually, everything that is needed for the working class to thrive on an estate is right in there. It's just been trapped in models of thinking and behavioral thinking that has said there's nothing good here. And if somebody's told enough, particularly at school, nothing good will come of you, what good can come of Nazareth? Nazareth will ultimately believe nothing good will come of it. But if we can start saying to Nazareth, there's something great can come out of Nazareth, something amazing can come out of Nazareth. Actually, everything that is needed for the salvation of the world was found in Nazareth. If we can say that the center and estate, everything that you need to succeed is found on the estate. We can shift that thinking, because the working class are intelligent, robust people. So I want to shift us to a positive urban theology. And some of the ideas I was set out are like this. David Shepherd, who was bishop in East London, he argued that the urban landscape is like a new Eden where God is walking with his people. So God is not somewhere else. Often the estate is seen as a place that is bereft, and you've got to leave it to find something amazing. Actually, what happens if the estate is a new Eden where God is willing and wanting to walk with his people? That actually it is a new place where God is present. So Roy Jocelyn, the incarnation is a move towards the working class. God leaves the throne and moves into the neighborhood. Well, really, he does move into the neighborhood. He does not move into the kingdom. Does not move into the palace. Uh, Jesus moves into Nazareth, the peasant place. So the incarnation shows us that God values and loves that environment. It's not just that it was the worst of places, it's that God loved it. And he births himself in there. So the incarnation is this move towards the working class. God is moving towards the working class, not away from the working class. Anna Ruddock talks about urban theology, calls for a deep commitment to the local place, that actually the local place is a place rich with community where families support each other. So the urban setting is a place where you will find deep commitment to each other, deep commitment to family. And actually, what is really interesting statistically, divorce in many working class estates is lower than some of the national average. There's a real deep commitment to family, and people commit in. That doesn't mean that people don't have affairs, or sometimes don't even get married. But within marriage, there's a deep, deep commitment. There's something important about family. People tend to stay in relationships long term. Um, Estates are diverse, they're multicultural. So, in other words, they really do look like the kingdom of God. Every tribe, every tongue can be found on the inner city estate. Multicultural places, diverse places. They're places of resilience and inner strength. People have persistence. They commit. They work hard. Mez McConnell talks about rich in resources with creativity and entrepreneurship. States are filled full of entrepreneurs. Sometimes the entrepreneurship is not bent towards good things, but there is a desire to make life work. And this will come up in a little while. There's something about the urban setting where life is defined by what I would say is the hustle, the hustle through life, the striving through life. So the entrepreneurialness will try to make money out of any means possible. If there is a way of thieving to sell something, or the way of making something to sell something, both are entrepreneurial. Sometimes that bent is towards negative things rather than positive things, but the sense of entrepreneurialness and creativity is right there in the inner city area. The working class, they are people that work hard and can be seen as co-laborers with God in urban renewal. If urban renewal is going to happen, it's not going to come from the middle class moving in. It's going to come from the working class as co-laborers with God. And this reminds me really of Isaiah 58, 11, 12. It says this: you will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins, will rise up the age-old foundations. You'll be called the repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. This is what I think the urban setting will see as we have a positive urban theology where the working class are seen as being resourceful and having all that they need. They will become the rebuilders of the ancient ruins. They will raise up those old foundations. They will be the repairer of broken walls, the restorer of streets, streets and dwellings. The working class working to rebuild itself. Um, if you think a little bit about the working class culture, books like A Framework for Understanding Poverty and Unreached by Tim Chester, just helpful books. Tim basically takes a lot of what he says and writes straight from Ruby Payne, quite clearly takes straight from Ruby Payne. But both those books talk about a culture. If you want to work in the urban setting, you need to understand the working class culture. The way that a middle class person thinks is different to the way that a working class person thinks. So if you just send a middle class person into a working class environment, they are really not going to thrive because they're going to think everybody thinks the same way they do, and then they're going to be disappointed to find that they do not at all. People on the estate don't think like the working class. So how do they think? Let's look at some of those things. Working class people tend to be defined by reputation, not education. They're not going to be interested in the education that they have. What gives them definition is the reputation that they have. How do those on my estate think of me? They tend to distrust authority. They tend to want friendship rather than authority. Which really is interesting. So when it comes to mission in the estate, what they're not looking for is people to come in with authority to teach them something. They want you to befriend them and become their mate. And from being their mate, they will trust what you have to say in there. But that takes a significant chunk of time. It is not going to happen overnight. So people that move into estates who suddenly think, I'm coming with some authority from this mission organization, I'm going to make a difference here. You are not going to make it because there is distrust of you. Your authority means nothing here on the estate. The working class hold what I describe as relational assets. Their asset, this value that they have, this credit that they have, is relational. So for them, relationships are important. This comes out their reputation and their relationships. These two things work together. So relationships are really important, and that relationship is more important than education. And we'll see that worked out in a little while. But this means that if your relationship is most important to you over anything else, if something comes up where that person needs you, then you are going to prioritize the relationship over your education, or as we see next, your diary. So working class tend to be non-diarized, and they prioritize these relationships over their plans. So you may have put a meeting in your diary, but if then something happens where that person that they know has a relationship issue, or they have somebody that they're in relationship with need them, they're going to drop you at the diary appointment because they're going to prioritize the relationship. That is what's more important to them. They tend to be less structured and tend to be more relational, as in If they bump into you in the street and you need something, they will be instantly with you, even if they've got a diary appointment. They tend to be a strange mix of overconfidence and no confidence. They tend to be overconfident to try and prove themselves, whilst at the same time crippling no confidence. They tend to have a poverty mindset, which leads to this sense of an entitled mentality, tend to think that they don't have anything compared to others. And it turns into this entitlement mentality. And that's what we see in the benefit system, where people feel like they're entitled to their benefits, even though they've not earned them, because it's a poverty mindset. Life is framed around what I describe as the hustle, which forms their identity. I'm going to wrestle my way, navigate, hustle my way through the world. They do tend to struggle with a more victim mentality, see themselves as victims of others who've put them in the position that they are in. They tend to be non-abstract. They tend to be concrete thinkers who do love stories. So metaphors don't work that well. They're concrete. They just want to know, how does this work? They want to know. Um, don't tell me a story. Tell me what the story's trying to teach me. Like they're more concrete in thinking. Which also means they tend to be more binary. They're polarized in their thinking. It's one thing or it's the other. So they're polarized in the way of thinking that sees the world in a very stark way. They see the world in terms of opposing camps. Conflict tends to be seen as disloyalty. So if you don't agree with me, then you are against me. So you tend to be an angel, or you tend to be the devil. You are an angel in that you are the best thing that they've ever known, and suddenly something happens where you disagree, and now you are evil and you aren't to be spoken to. So this is the thinking or the world view of a working class person. And the dangers, you can see that. So, well, that's incredibly negative. Actually, there's big credit here. There's credit in the sense that they are highly committed to relationships. They're highly committed to place. They are entrepreneurial. They will struggle through, but be entrepreneurial. So there's some real credit here and commitment here. This tends to be, these are relational assets. They tend to be more struck by how you see them than anything else. Which means, if you're told, right, why don't you go to university? They'll say, why would I go over there, go to university, where here I'm really valued? These people love me here. Will they love me anymore if I go and do that degree? No. So I'm gonna stay here. So people from the working class tend to be much more committed to locality and the place that they are at. So just some thinking there on class and culture and biblical principles. So in the research, I wanted to look at how the working class experienced the Church of England. So I wanted to look at people who were candidates to be church leaders, as well as working class people who were ordained. I also want to look at what the experts think about how you go about training working class people. So there's these three groups of people that I was interested in spending more time with. I did this through online surveys. I had 450 individuals, working class individuals, who've been in the discernment process of church leadership, discernment, training, and deployed as priests. So I did an online survey, just two focus groups with 8 individuals, and then 20 semi-structured interviews, of which about 8 of them were with working class priests, and 12 of them were with experts who train working class leaders. So the general findings that I found: working class people articulated struggling to feel wanted in the Church of England. They described themselves as being risky to the Church of England or misunderstood by the Church of England. They largely said that they just don't fit the classroom setting and were put off training for church leadership, for ordained leadership particularly, because it was based around classroom training. Like, I'm not interested in that form of training, so I'm not going to look at being ordained. They felt that their clothes made them stand out, that the t-shirts that they wore made them stand out, and that their language was a problem, the way that they talk, either through having a very strong accent or using the kind of vernacular language that just wouldn't translate into the classroom setting. They worked hard to adapt and fit into the Church of England. And those that did do that described the process as really affecting their mental and emotional health, that they felt that the effect of trying to be something they were not really affected their mental well-being. They simply said that the Church of England could not understand their home setting. You know, many working class people are not just working, they're also carers for elderly relatives and family, because those elderly relatives can't afford to maybe go into care homes or have retirement care. So often they felt the Church of England did not understand the setting of those working class people. And they found that there were middle and upper class assumptions that were just never explained. We are going to have supper on Thursday night. Will you come to supper? For many people, supper was tea and toast, not canapes. So there are middle class assumptions that in the language that was just never explained. Few of my findings, three quotes here that I thought were really exceptional and interesting for us. One priest said this: I was well thought of at home on the estate. People liked me, and I had a lot of social credit. At the college, I was seen as the village idiot. Another priest said this: one of my friends, removed the name, when she came to train, that's for ordination, someone sat down with her quite early on and said this: if you are going to train for ordination in the Church of England, you will need to be able to speak not just to peers, but to bishops and archdeacons. So you're going to need to change the way you talk and dress more professionally. Which links to this quote from an expert. I thought this was brilliant and really perceptive. The Church of England see ordination as infirming the gift that you were called and then sending you away to change. And that's what that person was talking about here. They'd arrived at the college and told, if you're going to be in the Church of England, you are going to need to not just connect with your peers, but bishops and archdeacons. Therefore, you're going to need to change the way that you speak. You're going to have to change the way that you dress. And that came through time and time again, working class people feeling like the Church of England did not understand them and wanted them to change to fit their world. And therefore, that was putting people off. The experts, those who trained working class priests, said this: the Durham accreditation, that's a particular model of accreditation that the Church of England used, coming from Durham University. This was highly criticized, and it just doesn't work. It is only setting us up for an academic model of training, and it doesn't work. The experts also made certain observations. They said this: that context-based training with mentoring is essential for the training of working class leaders. Context-based with mentoring is essential. We need an accessible entry point for training for those that have never done GCSEs, never done A levels, and that kind of thing. People that have never read essays. If you grew up on an estate and you got a job as a hairdresser, or you got as a job as a shelf stacker, or on the local building site, you've never written an essay. So being expected to enter that system was just ridiculous. So there needed to be a better entry point. So something that was a bit like an A level that moved you up to other training, but gave you an accessible entry point to training. And that this new entry point needed to be customizable and flexible at a pace that really worked for the individual that was entering. They recognize that tutors need to realize that they know absolutely nothing, that a lot of the tutors come from middle and upper class worldviews, and that their worldview just does not work. So if you think that value came in your academic thinking, and then you've got a classroom of people who don't value this is about relationship, this is about friendship, this is about having a relational asset, they're not going to be interested in this academic training for the purpose of getting a certificate. They're looking at the relationships that they want to build and form within that setting. So tutors, we need to realize we know nothing. And that's going to be a theme that comes out not only for tutors, but for selectors and for mentors. Context and communal learning is highly recommended by 60% of the experts. And what they talked about was the need of an apprenticeship model for training. Get out of the classroom, get into apprenticeships. That was repeated time and time and time again. And the experts said, but the institutional church does not want that because it's hard to accredit. And they talked about needing an asset-based approach, which starts with the student's experience, where it based and builds itself upon the assets that the students already have, the experiences they already have. They talked about mentoring being essential as a part of the support. They talked about assessments work to be done, particularly around portfolio-based assessments rather than exam-based assessments, rather than essay writing, more portfolio, and that people would build up a portfolio of work that would then help them. So, for example, a portfolio around how to do a pastoral meeting, how to engage with a funeral, how to explore marriage with a couple, how to put on a mission event, a portfolio of work that was missional, that was pastoral, that was also character development. They talked about this being the long-term relationships, and we needed to recognize that failure would be a part of this, that people entering the system that came from the working class may not have all the character assets developed in them, and therefore there may be moral failure as a part of this process, but that has to be worked with, and therefore long-term relationships of a mentor and a coach or a master working them with them over a longer period of time, not just blocks of 3 years, 3-year training at college, 3-year curacy. And good examples, who's been a game at this? Well, the Aston training scheme that happened in the 80s was a scheme that was highly thought of by those that had been on it and those that had taught on it. It had stopped because of politics and money, not because it was a poor training scheme. And it was all based around getting people to access learning at a level that was appropriate for them. It was based in the local setting. The Peter stream that comes out of St. Mellitus was well thought of, but many said on it that it has a long way to go to becoming perfect. But it was a good start in helping people access theological training. But it still was based in the classroom and still was based on academic teaching. And often the people on the Peter stream would say they're just taking Peters and wanting them to become Pauls. And the classroom setting had to change on the Peter stream, but it still was thought of well. Church Army was very highly thought of in some of the lay training that they are doing based on estates. Edge Ministries again was highly thought of in terms of its apprenticeship models, and the Antioch network that is growing leaders, both ordained and non-ordained, in planting churches through more of an apprenticeship coaching model. So they were good examples. So my key recommendations as we kind of move towards landing, there was 4 recommendations that came out. One was to improve the selection process for leadership and for priesthood. The second was to transform the training systems, what's in place at the moment for training. We need to optimize the deployment models, the way that we deploy people at the moment, and also engagement from working class people. We need more working class people engaged in the training of working class people. So let's just go through these briefly and succinctly. Improving selection process. Across the board, those that had been through the selection process, as well as those that had recently been on it, talked about the selection process. The applications need to be shorter and the forms need to be broken down. Long application forms is nothing but off-putting if you've never filled. Many people from the working class setting have never filled in an application form that's more than an A4 page where they've put in their details. They'll walk into a shop or they'll walk into a building site. They don't need a massive CV, so they've never written an application form. So suddenly being asked to fill out long application forms that talk about your story and your history and your testimony, they all need breaking down into smaller pieces that they can work through and process. They talked a lot about how first conversations with potential leaders needed to not be in the room of a ordained priest surrounded by books, in a vicar study, but those first meetings needed to be in the local context, and they needed to be in an understanding of what is the cost going to be for these meetings. And many people who got shift work, If you start work at 6 at night and finish at 6 in the morning, and you need to go see somebody, be aware of the timings. And it also means that, if you're going to have 6 evening meetings to come and, as a part of a cohort, explore leadership. Well, that does not work if you are in a shift pattern where you're working from 6 in the morning to 6 at night. There needs to be an understanding of the implications of your work patterns. Selectors must retrain. Working class cultural contexts are different. We already talked about that, but many of those that were in the selection process talked about the sense of being judged by people, the candidates feeling that they were not understood. The whole process of selection needs to be more transparent. What's the time commitment? How many peak times am I going to have to meet? And how much is it going to cost me? Many people don't have cars. They're traveling by public transport. There's a cost for these discernments. It costs to go see people. What is that cost? Can we be upfront about that? Because it may well be that people might need assistance to cover the cost of those meetings. So transparency over the length of time, and that these meetings need to be supportive and need to be in plain language, clear, plain language. A lot of conversation about the Church of England needing to recruit working class champions or advocates. If you're going through the discernment process, you need to have an advocate that is like you, that is from the working class setting, that understands your context, can help you and also challenge you. And help you understand what's being said. If it's been said by somebody that's middle class and it's not being understood, kind of explain that for you, but also challenge. Yeah, maybe there's some snobbery in there that you might need to work through. So yes, recruiting working class champions. Then there is something really important around welcoming and inclusiveness. And having an environment where people feel safe and welcome. There needs to be a place where people can celebrate their story from their context. And actually, you're from an estate and you come to faith in that estate. Let's celebrate what has happened for you on your estate. So really celebrating people's own stories and therefore making them feel valued. Their story is valuable. We've got to be making introductions, helping people connect. Can I introduce you to Jane? Many working class people felt like they were on the edge, that they found it quite difficult to approach people who looked very well dressed, and therefore to introduce people and befriend, to facilitate relationship building. There's a lot mentioned about clothing, a lot mentioned about language, and a lot mentioned about humor. So if we're going to welcome the working class, we need to make them feel like their clothing and their language is okay. And you're going to do that if you've got other working class people in the room as a part of that discernment process, people seen at the front as people also from working class settings. So as we look at the training, we need to develop, and the Church of England needs to develop and accredit an apprenticeship training route. I've entitled it here as the apprenticeship training for priesthood. We need something that talks about apprenticeship and talks about training and using the title apprenticeship so that working class candidates can see that fits me. This is not for everybody. Some people would love a more academic training route, but this is for those that really feel like this is something that they need. So this academic apprenticeship model, I think, needs to be based around workshops. And it needs to be around a portfolio building, not around essays in classroom. Workshop where there's some content brought, but also then there's big time to workshop a problem solving together. We need to be thinking about long-term relationship building for people. And we need to be thinking about training times and locations that work well for the working class. Now, that's particularly for those that are working part-time, doing evening training. We need to think about how those locations and those times might work for the working class. The training needs to be bespoke. And an apprenticeship model would lean towards that becoming bespoke. So it's filling the gaps that people have. And we need to recognize that there is gifting already in the room. So imagine this, you're running an apprenticeship training school for leadership. It's workshop based. You would turn to somebody who's on that program and say, hey, you've been a plumber. You spend a lot of your time as a plumber going into people's homes. Would you do a 30-minute workshop for us about what it's like going into someone's home for the first time? What you learn that helped stepping into somebody's home to make them feel comfortable that you are now in their space, and actually learn from the gifting that is in the room? We also need trainers, some training for educators on working class culture. This keeps coming up. Training the trainers, training the discerners, training for those that are middle class and upper class to understand the working class culture and behavior. Topics, there's lots of teaching topics, but a few that really jumped out. One around character development. There is something significant for the working class where some of the character formation stuff hasn't necessarily happened in their growth. And so there may need to be some specific training on what is the character of a leader. Conflict resolution was another one that came up, how to resolve conflict well, strategic planning. Like if you've worked as a shelf stacker, you may never have made plans on how to move from one place to another, how to take a vision from one place to another. It's not been a part of your pre-training life. So strategic planning. Yeah, what about Anglican 101? It's not just middle and upper class or work out, it can be more broader, but there's something about helping the working class understand the language of the middle and upper class denomination and church. So when it comes to the deployment of working class people, deployment needs to be done with a more of a 9-year mentor and support structure bedded in. 3 years training, 3 years curacy, and then 3 years continued support into their first church plant or into their first leadership role. Could be incumbency or it could be a lay leader role. But seeing that individual as a 9-year process, training, deployment, and then post deployment. So beyond curacy. Curates and first incumbencies and church planting opportunities should be matched with the priest. And numbers of priests were planted or put into churches that were just not appropriate. There was numbers of curates that I interviewed who said actually their first incumbency was in a middle class environment and they just felt like a fish out of water. They did not fit it, and they therefore felt that there was something wrong with them and that their giftings were not useful in that setting. We need to match working class curates with settings where they're going to succeed and they are going to thrive, rather than just random allocation with large churches who've always had curates. Numbers of stories where large churches just received a curate because they've always had a curate, and then that working class person was like, wow, I do not fit this setting. What's wrong with me? Rather than it being the setting that was wrong. We do need to intentionally foster ongoing peer connections and networking between working class priests, having networks of working class priests supporting each other over a long period of time. Working class engagement. And so those that had experienced working class tutors, incumbents, mentors really succeeded because they had somebody championing them in their world. So working class engagement, we need to implement working class peer mentoring with candidates, mentoring right from the early process of selection into the training, 3-year training, into 3 years at curacy, into the 3 years beyond. It may not necessarily be the same person throughout that process, but certainly having somebody that's in a long-term relationship with you all the way through, making sure that there is good working class peer mentoring. And then secondly, working class co-facilitating their training. Many working class people said the moment they had the one working class lecturer or had the one working class person come in to talk about urban missionary, that was the moment where they suddenly felt valued and that they could fit. Well, that shouldn't be the one-off. It should be the regular, and it should be the priority. So having working class people, priests, lecturers, co-facilitating the training right from the early stages, it seems to be quite a significant finding that we need to implement. So my reflections, I've gone through this doctorate project. I realized I'm more passionate about this than I realized. I realised that the Church of England is disconnected from the reality of the working class. That essentially the Church of England do not understand the working class. They don't understand the environment. They don't understand the people. They're arrogant in thinking that they do. And they think that the working class have been given the opportunity, that the working class just haven't taken it, and it's not true. Your language, your behavior, your clothing, your study, surrounded by books, all of this communicates that you do not fit. Um, and I think that we need to um, help the working class uh, place working class leaders in the heart of that institution to change the institution so it understands. Um, so there's something about seeing more working class bishops and working class directors of ordinands and working class priests is really important. And I would say within this, I now understand myself better. I would describe myself as a working class lad who can who's bilingual. I can speak the working class language and I can speak the middle class language. So I've grown to become bilingual because I've had to navigate a working class Church of England. There's another bit that I didn't mention, but I somewhere in those findings, there's also the importance of training happening not in the theological college, but train happening on estates in community centres and in communal spaces. Numbers of the working class candidates said, I would have loved my training to have actually come from the estates. Traveling to other candidates' estates for training rather than always going to the theological college, which tended to be for quite academic areas. So there you go. I've got time for any Q&A and you're not here to do it. But that is my research. Jesus called the working class training, working class church leadership, findings on discernment, training, and deployment. So I hope that has been somewhat interesting to you. There'll be other content coming from my doctorate research, but that's the general big picture findings of my doctorate and the implications for us in the Church of England. I'd love to hear your thoughts and I'd love to hear your feedback.